So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. So in this session, we're going to be looking at regulation, transparency and reporting. There's been a clear global move towards increased regulatory reporting, a requirement for more transparency. We're all, I'm sure, very aware of SFTR and it's being kind of implemented through 2020 and 2021. But we've got other regulatory reporting obligations sort of coming down the pipeline, both the CFTC Rewrite and the SFTR equivalent in the US. So we're going to just look at some of these regulatory reporting obligations and the implication it is to the securities finance industry and businesses. So with no further ado, let me introduce or ask my panel to introduce themselves. If we start with Ed.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ed Oliver from ESEC Lending, responsible for product development initiatives, which for my sins includes regulatory change.
Thank you. Fabian.
Hello, I'm Fabian Romero. I'm working for the global regulatory reporting solution of S&P Global with special focus on managed services.
And Gary.
Just leaves me then. Hi everyone, I'm Gary Plummer. I'm at JP Morgan. I'm one of the agency's security finance product managers. And similar to Ed, I oversee the regulatory and tax agenda for the product.
Brilliant. Well, great panel. Looking forward to the session. I think we'll kick off. Fabian, I believe you've put together some slides for us to have a look at the regulatory landscape and the roadmap ahead, just to set the scene a little bit.
Yeah, so I believe we're going to see the timeline in a moment. So we're here today to speak about the regulatory reporting landscape. So it's not something which came out just yesterday. As we see, it's an initiative which started already like years back. 2007 MiFID, CFTC in 2012, the EMEA MiFID, the application in 2014, 2018. And then we see that something similar happening all over Asia, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, and going forward. So a lot of these regulations have been gone live already for a few years, but we're seeing learning from the implementation of these various regulations, the various regulator going through some refit or rewrite of this existing regulation. So upcoming in front of us, I think that the first one, as you see here, is going to be the CFTC Rewrite. It's already was available. The rules were released in January 21. There was a further delay in terms of applications, so should have been May 25th. Now we're talking the 5th of December. So there will be like two phases for CFTC. First one being the actual submission changes, like new data field, timing, and trade of state. And then there will be a phase 2 arriving in later next year with regard to the ISO, introduction of ISO and UPI. ISO, which is like already familiar, I think, to the users of the SFTR regulation. And we see also coming in late Q3 some mass rewrites in Asia, ASIC, something in Australia, and in early Q1 24. That's the expectation that we're going to go through this EU EMIR refits. So we're still waiting for the feedback on the consultation paper. Should come in the next few months, hopefully, and then that would encompass the application start of 2023. Something similar, same timeline with regard to the GFSA in Japan with regard to the rewrite. So a lot behind us, but a lot in terms of regulatory reporting in front of us, which is it's not only for obviously derivatives, but also it impacts a lot of the securities finance space, right? It's not only repo securities lending, but if you do structured trades, if you deal with future forward options, as a head of desk or head of compliance, you're being captured under these various regulations. Sorry, long introduction.
Oh, that's perfect. That really sets the scene nicely. So thank you for that. Before we start looking forward to some of the potential and changes sort of coming down the pipeline, I think it would be remiss of us not to look at SFTR and where we are today and some of the experiences we've had. So I wonder if I could ask Gary to give us a feel for the current status of SFTR and some of the experiences perhaps you and your clients have had in getting to where we are.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think it builds on what Fabian said with that timeline. When you look at where we are with SFTR at the moment, for some of us, we're coming up to living with it for 2 years. We're moving up towards that. It's 15, 16 months. We've seen a couple of reports, and we'll probably talk a little bit later, out of ESMA about the quality of the data and some of the things they focused on. But I think from a perspective of an agent lender and from our clients, what they've seen is an increased attention to having to look at the flow of data that's going through and how is that managed, and also being aware of a lot of the additional fields that they've had to enrich some of the core trading information with in order to facilitate the reporting that ESMA and the national competent authorities have asked for. And some of that's been challenging. We've seen hiccups along the way, particularly in the areas of not everybody having LEIs for all issuers and things like that. And some of those are still undoubtedly going to happen again. But I think it really has been, by comparison, I'm sure experts who looked at the EMIR regulation when it first came in, I think there's been a lot learned from that has helped SFTR start in a better way. It's been, in our view, at least a slightly smoother start to how that run through. But we are now starting to see questions coming back out from clients that are being prompted from their own oversight and potentially from discussions that they're having with their own regulators about how the reporting is operating.
Yeah, that's interesting. Ed, I see you nodding there. It's a similar story from your client perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I think when we look back a few years when SFTR was still in its embryonic stages and we went on conferences and panels and people with EMIR experience came in, it was quite scary because EMIR matching rates were still quite low, and obviously, their day one experience was pretty terrible compared to what we ultimately succeeded with SFTR. And I think, Gary's right in terms of here we are 18 months in, but the hard work was really done in the 2 or 3 years prior. The work that the industry association did and the working groups pulling together participants to really go through a deep dive on every single field that is being reported. That was the key to success with SFTR. And, absolutely, there's been little hiccups and things along the route, but it was relatively smooth. And of course, the matching rates on the matching fields was pretty high. The pairing rates were pretty high to start off with. So I think, the key to success really was the industry effort in terms of pulling everyone together and developing best practice. I think I'd echo Gary's comments actually about the sort of client experience. I think generally it was positive in terms of, getting used to the data that was being provided. I think gradually we've been able to produce better MIS to help clients understand that. But I think now we're starting to see the odd question come up as I think the compliance groups or the regulatory reporting groups in the client operations are starting to get their heads around what the data shows and starting to raise questions. So I think, I'd echo Gary's comments on that, and I think we should expect to see that continue.
That's interesting. And do you think that the regulators had higher expectations of SFTR because of the EMIR, and do you think the industry really sort of felt that pressure?
That's a good question. I can't speak for the regulators in terms of what they would have expected from SFTR. No, I think. I think probably there was a lessons learned, and many of our institutions clearly went through EMIR as well. So I think we've benefited from the fact EMIR went first. Whether we out sort of played the regulators' expectations on day one in terms of pairing and matching rates? I suspect we did, but again, securities finance is a different industry to derivatives and swaps activity, and so we already had reconciliation tools in place. We've had those for many years, so we're already reconciling many of the fields that we're having to reconcile for SFTR. Obviously, there's a whole ton more, but we had the core right, and I think that helped us as well.
Yeah, and we mentioned the ESMA data quality reports and their sort of the views that they've opined on around SFTR. Fabian, what are the key themes that have come out of that? Where are the areas that the regulators are really sort of looking to focus on?
I think what's very interesting is in terms of pairing ratio, where SFTR being a 2-year regulation versus EMIR, which has been now since like 2014, so eight years now. The pair matching similar around the 60%. What has been the key benefit? One of the key benefits is the introduction of these additional measures with regard to, for example, the ISO 20022 for the submission to the trade repository being compulsory, which is expected to be introduced in the EMIR rewrite. So it's like back into a loop. So, what we've learned with the last regulation and imply that. Interestingly, also, we're seeing this being considered for other rewrites around the planet. So there is definitely in terms of like standardization of the submission of the data, there is a lot of lesson learned from the various regulators. We see also that the regulators are speaking more together to trying to not standardize to the fact that it will be like the same report, but see what is being done elsewhere, see what has been a success, and applying to their own local version of what they want to get out of it. In term of the ESMA quality reports, one thing was interesting that this comparison really between EMI and SFTR in parallel is really the regulator looks at it into as a complementary set of regulation and not to be taken into isolation, right? So there is like to a degree like interdependencies, and that sends us back to the data quality. Right. So if you send nonsense into a system, you're going to have like nonsense coming out. So it's really put emphasis onto the firms to look into data quality to be provided. So there are other initiatives within the industry, such as common data models, something like this, which are some interesting initiatives. Still need to be a bit more development there, but it's interesting. Other emphasis that the ESMA also looked into was a comparison between the various local regulators and the various zones in Europe, where you could see that for a set of like something like timeliness of the reporting, you had like a vast divergence between the various regulators, where I think some Nordic countries you had like 5% late, where in Southern Europe you had like 5% on time. So the short of it is you see that the regulator really starting to go into the details of what's being sent to them. Not only hasn't been sent, but is what's in there. There was also, I think, some analysis, not named, but there was apparently one big firms who did not provide termination from the trade. So you had a pool of outstanding trades keep rising and rising and rising. And suddenly this one reporting counterparty finally did something about it. And you had like really a decrease of millions of outstanding trades at the TR within a month. So really it sends us back to this data quality. I think that's the key words there.
Yeah, as part of that report, one of the comments that I picked up on was, a recommendation that the national regulators and ESMA should put aside more resource and more time for continuous monitoring. Do you think that's the bit that's yet to come from SFTR in terms of their reading of the data and the sort of extrapolation of assumptions or whatever it might be from that data. Is that the next sort of stage now that they're presumably building up a backlog of data?
Yeah, briefly before giving the floor to Gary and Ed, but yeah, absolutely. It is very much really diving into this data and trying to cut it. I think there was some feeling from some in the industry that the regulator is not even looking at what we're sending. Well, now we know that they are definitely looking at it. So seeing that NAC ratio, for example, pairing matching, peer comparison, they're looking at the moment maybe for the one which is like really standing out of the crowd. Yeah. But obviously, slowly but surely, there will be more analysis on the various fields. Ed, Gary?
Yeah, I think we all asked ourselves, didn't we, when we saw the scope of SFTR, what are they going to do with all of this data? And I think, now that they've had it and they've had it for a while, it doesn't surprise me to hear that they're resourcing up to really get to understand it better and to do more analysis on it. And I think if we consider what the potential benefits of this might be, this is all about giving transparency to our industry, to the regulators, and they can understand it better. They can ask sensible questions. And then we as an industry can hopefully sort of improve that dialogue with regulators. And I think if I look at it from a practitioner's perspective, there are a number of things we'd want to do in Europe over the next few years. And one of them, if we look at the UCITS and the alternative investment funds and the securities lending rules that apply to those constituents, there's clearly some work that could be done to broaden the securities lending capabilities of those entities. And I think one of the things that I'd love to see, and again, I've probably got my rose-tinted spectacles on or my glass half full, but one of the things I'd really like to see is that this helps that conversation, and we as an industry can move those discussions forward and perhaps provide better opportunities for those constituents. So that would be my sort of best case scenario coming out of the fact we've got a lot more data going in.
If I could add, I completely agree, Ed. And I think when you look at what Fabian said, we can see from the quality report, ESMA and the national competent authorities have taken their 2 snapshots. They talk about it in the report. It's clear they want to kind of resource up to do that more frequently and to analyze the data further. I think as an industry, we should be able to engage with them and then build upon that, as you said, Ed, to highlight to them that actually perhaps other restrictions you see around some of the regulated funds, some of the alternative funds as well, that they're not really of value to a certain extent because the data can support that you can see the activity that's going on. And so by excluding large segments or large trade types, that doesn't really give you the benefit maybe you thought, and we should as an industry be able to work with them to analyze that data, to highlight certain positions. And I think that could be really powerful over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's great that there's, it's a clear potential benefit to the industry that we can use this consolidated data in that way. And I know it's a question I've been asking for many years in terms of, we're sort of producing a huge amount of data specifically for the regulators and to meet the obligations, but there must be benefits back to the market. There must be ways of using that data, whether that's within your own firm and your own firm's data or the consolidated data across the industry with the regulators, but actually sort of extracting some real value for us as well as an industry. And I think that's a really interesting kind of perspective, that sort of like essentially using the regulators' data to persuade the regulators to move the rules to make it more of a level playing field for some of these funds. So I think it's yet to be proven, but a very clear benefit.
I think that there are already some benefits today to the industry, right? You're able, thanks to this pairing and matching, to identify breaks with your counterparty much faster. So which going to improve your settlement, for example. Instead of like waiting the last minute and realize, oh, I have a different quantity or I booked the wrong code, then you identify this straight away after you booked it. Or you're bidding. You don't have to wait the end of the month to realize that you're totally out of line with your counterparty. So if you want to analyze this data today as a firm, you are able to do that already today. And then there is an interesting case of this of the Brexit divergence. So after Brexit, I think the number of or the volume reported under SMASH went down by 50%. So I say, oh, great. So let's do work for us. Let's do for us. But the data is still there, right? It had to be reported to the FCA instead to ESMA. And this exercise of reconciliation is still possible. You don't have to break it down. You can still utilize all these efforts this structure that you put together really to get some value out of it. Again, improving settlement, improving bidding with the counterparty. So yeah, I think it's already beneficial to the industry.
I think it's interesting. Gary, just a quick question to you on that. It's like, obviously the industry worked really hard to get this data ready and get the regulatory reporting. Has that data been sort of brought back into the business for the purposes that Fabian's just been mentioning? Or are we still seeing the regulatory reporting almost as a separate stream of data, and the sort of reconciliation process is still using the original data? I mean, I'm sure we'll get to where we're describing, but is that happening, that kind of one set of data being used internally for your internal processes and checks and balances as well as being sent to the regulator, or are they separate streams still?
I think it's a journey to get there. It's starting to happen.
Yeah.
The J word that we don't like to use. Fabian's absolutely right. There are some clients and some processes where it is, and we're integrating that as well. And I think ultimately that's where you'd want to be, and I think that's where potentially we will all end up. I just don't think we're quite there yet across all of the various elements.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable position to be, really, because, like I say, the focus was on really delivering the regulatory reporting, and the sort of bringing it back into the business, maybe a separate kind of process. Ed, from your perspective, has the demands from your client changed, or your clients changed because of SFTR? Obviously, we have all of this extra data, we have all of this information. In terms of the sort of MI and reporting requirements back to your clients, are they becoming sort of more demanding because they know you have this? Is it changing?
I think clients' reporting requirements have changed over the last few years anyway. So, I think we all have, bells and whistles in terms of portals that clients can use that have pie charts and funky looking stuff that shows how much money people are making in Securities and what's on loan, the collateral, etc. But the reality is, over the last few years, clients want a data dump. Really, they want us to produce all the data that's relevant to them, give it to them to play with as they want. That's where the requirement has gone. So we see less people using the sort of bells and whistles sort of applications, and actually just the core requirement is just give us the data, and then that gets taken into the client systems and gets maybe amalgamated with other data to be able to produce core sort of data for them. So I think the reality is SFTR has given us a lot more data fields that we could potentially provide. But I don't think clients are actually interested in many of those. I think it's still comes down to the core risk management. So they want to know collateral, they want to know margin rates, they want to know what's on loan, they want to know failed recalls. It's that kind of key metric, and I don't think that's really changed very much. I'd be interested in Gary's thoughts, but that's certainly sort of where I sit on the client reporting question.
Yeah, I would agree. I think as we will all say, you will see a spectrum. You're going to have some clients who will just want to take the front end. They like the pie chart. It meets what they want. It highlights those key bits. And then as you move through the spectrum of clients you deal with, you're going to have those that want the big data dump. They're going to want to look through all of that. They're going to do a lot of detailed analysis behind it. And I think SFTR has just given a bunch of extra fields for people to be able to look at, and having the technology to be able to share that with clients is important. I think one kind of footnote I would add as a kind of anecdote of experience, what we have started to see over recent months are clients starting to pay a little bit more attention to the pairing and matching data. I know Fabian's talked about that as well, to the extent that we've had certain clients look at it and say, well, if I've got a counterparty where the pairing and matching is really low, let's dive into why that is. And if there are reasons that can't be resolved, we might want to think about whether we want to deal with that counterparty or not, because it might, if it carries on being very low, it's like a red flag to the regulator. And do they want that? And so I think that's the early stages of clients understanding that data a little bit more and starting to use it actively in some of their decision making. Yeah. Very early days on it, but I think that's clearly an example of something that we've seen, and I'd be interested in Fabian or Ed's feedback if others have seen it. But that kind of goes from that in that direction.
It's interesting to see that the regulatory post-trade is starting to have an impact actually on some commercial decision going forwards, which counterparty I'm going to deal with.
Which the regulators always specified that a reporting regulation should never change market behaviours, but if it's informing those commercial decisions, then clearly it's going to start changing behaviours.
Well, I think it's the beneficial owner's responsibility to report accurately. So they clearly, if they understand the data and they understand things like matching and pairing rates, it's their responsibility, isn't it, to determine whether they want to make steps on that. So it's moved away from us as agent lenders. We see issues with borrowers that pop up occasionally, and we go and have conversations with them, and we work through them together. That's generally the way that this industry in particular works. But here we actually have a different party looking at it with a different lens, and I think that's a healthy conversation. At the end of the day, we all say it's our client's securities lending program, so it's up to them to define the parameters we work within. And if this becomes a bigger topic for them, then you will start to see discussions like this happen, I think.
That's really interesting. It moves us quite nicely on to a sort of looking forward. Obviously, we've got a further challenge around SFTR coming up in terms of the additional matching fields that are required. I think it's December that they kick in. Do you think we're ready? Do you think this is going to have a major impact, or are there issues and concerns that we need to consider? Ed, I wonder if you could.
Yeah, I think there's 6 fields in January, I think, from what I recall, that are going to kick in. So, and I think with all of them, I think that's where we'll take that back as appropriately we should to the working groups and say, okay, let's make certain we've got these lined up and we understand what we're going to be contributing to those data fields. So I think it's clearly a smaller subset of data than we had to look at for day one. We have added further fields since then. So I'm not necessarily concerned about it. I think we just need to make certain that everyone is on the same page as we go into that.
Yeah. And Fabian, is that your position as well?
Yeah, we as a solution provider, we had the pipe built in from the start. So we up and running on that, ready to go for the past 2 years already. So in collaboration with our clients, we just make sure that we have the right understanding, the right field to be sent. It will be like seamless for our clients, like the SFTR specification changes which happen for ESMA in January, for FCA in April. It had been seamless for us. So yeah, it's bright on our side.
Gary, anything to add to that?
Nothing different. It's the same thing, and I would echo Ed. I think the key here is that the industry makes sure that we understand what it is they're wanting and what we can bring to the table, and then work with Fabian and the other solution providers to make sure that it is, as it has been with the 2 updates so far that we've seen through, pretty much almost a non-event, kind of seamless. I know there's lots of stuff going on in the background, but to the clients, it just flowed through.
Yeah.
It is true, isn't it, that it's still relatively early stages of SFTR, yet we have seen some big things already. So Brexit obviously dropped in on us very quickly after we went live. So we had to all work through that as an industry. And for some of us, there were TR transitions that had to happen as well when One Trade Repository pulled out of SFTR. So yeah, I think we've seen some reasonably big projects associated with SFTR already. So I would hope that an additional few fields shouldn't be too challenging for us.
Yeah. It's good, isn't it? Securities finance always astounds me at how quickly and how efficiently it can adapt to these things. As you say, it sort of becomes almost BAU to implement these changes and move that sort of reporting suite forward. It always amazes me how efficiently we can do these things. I don't know why it amazes me, but it does. I should expect it, really. So just looking sort of beyond the European SFTR, the other one that's sort of on the horizon, I guess, and in consultation is the US version, so the 10C1. And on the surface, it looks very simple. Certainly compared to the European SFTR, much less fields, much less matching requirements. So, can I assume that this is a doddle and we're just gonna implement this without any issues? Let's start with Ed.
Okay, so we don't quite know the scope yet. So I think it's very difficult to comment on that until we truly know what are the transactions that are going to be reported and who is going to have to report them, where in the chain are they if they're going to have to report. So I think it's very difficult to answer that at this point in time. However, and I was, we had a client conference in Boston 3 weeks ago, and I had an audience of US beneficial owners who were kind of asking the same question. And I think I would point to what we have achieved with SFTR as whatever comes out, I suspect we'll deal with it. Now, there are some key differences as well. It is one-sided reporting, so that's a big difference to SFTR and very beneficial to the industry in terms of some of the challenges we've already spoken about with pairing and matching rates will not be prevalent for this. But I think the timing is the one that I think we all focus on, the sort of 15-minute window for reporting. I think that potentially will throw challenges up. I think where you sit in the chain, the type of transactions you do, whether you're doing pooled securities finance transactions or whether you're doing segregated transactions, will throw up different challenges for different firms. So I think the short answer is I think it's difficult to say whether it's going to be a doddle. I suspect it will never be a doddle, but I think we're very well positioned, having done SFTR, and this was the message I really provided to the US audience. We have gone through a massive project here. And I think as long as we are able, again, as an industry, to pull together, and once we know what's involved, really work out best practice for how to do it, I'm sure we'll work through it. But there are some unique challenges to 10C1 that don't exist for SFTR. That's correct.
Gary, from your perspective, I presume you're, like JP Morgan, are putting together a huge project team to manage this, and sort of do you see any kind of key issues or concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo what Ed. I mean, I wrote down on my piece of paper as you were asking the question, devil is in the detail on this one, and I really think that is the case. As Ed's highlighted, the scope, and everybody in the discussions we've had with clients and with vendors and with other members of the industry, it very much is, there's a focus on the timing of having to report within 15 minutes. But then you look behind that, and then you think about how does that fit into the model that we all operate generally in the industry now. And you think particularly around, and the one that we've picked up on and talked to some clients and others about, is collateral. So the 10C1 proposal is expecting you to tell the regulator the collateral that you've allocated to that loan within 15 minutes. And that practically, in the way that most of us operate our collateral programs, doesn't happen because you collateralize en bloc. It's agreed at the end of the day. And so you're never going to know that within 15 minutes of a loan being agreed. So explaining that to the regulator and having an active dialogue, going in some ways back to something we talked about with SFTR and the role of the industry groups in helping them to come together and understand as an industry where we want this to be. We will adapt to it because that's what we've done. And I completely agree with what Ed said around SFTR. That is the kind of the litmus test we can point to say that's how we implemented a very complicated set of requirements. But I think we also need to work with the regulator to understand their motive behind some of their proposals and to help them just understand some of the challenges that what they're putting on the paper throws up. And I know the industry group that's been working on it has focused on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to me that the 15-minute reporting sort of feels more like a secondary market kind of driven sort of comparison rather than a sort of if you really understand the way securities finance works and is executed and settled. So it does feel certainly if we apply some logic and sense to it that's something that could be resolved. And I know in Europe there's been questions asked about the fact that the mismatch in the timing around collateral reporting and transaction reporting means that invariably sometimes you can look like you're under collateralized anyway just because of that mismatch. And the regulators certainly in Europe seem to understand that. So hopefully we can move that forward.
I think beyond the timing also, which probably is the big one, there are other outstanding question. So with regard to, for example, if this has to be reported to FINRA, to a national registered security association, but you have to be registered there. So not necessarily every firms will be registered, or if you're not, then you can delegate it to your broker dealer to report on your behalf. But then there is this part where as an agent lender or as a lender, you also have apparently the obligation that under the current proposition to report your book of lendable assets. So I'm not going to speak for Ed and Gary, but as an agent lender, I'll be a bit touchy or disclosing or putting my trust in the broker dealer to report this on my behalf. So there are some interesting mechanics there that probably needs to be clarified.
I think, Fabian, that's a point I'd written down to mention is around that reporting, because it's, what have we got on loan in aggregate, but also what's available to be lent in that particular stock in aggregate. And that in itself, when you look at those two fields, and I'd be interested in Ed's view in a moment, but it poses some kind of unique issues, because if you're lending the same stock to multiple broker dealers and you delegate your reporting, what do you tell each broker dealer? Do you give them the aggregate position to each of them? So therefore, potentially what's then feeding into FINRA will be overinflated. And then equally, when you look at the availability, how do you factor in clients who limit the program for their own choice, but also because their own regulations require them not to lend total positions? Do you do that? You might have a fund that imposes a 33% limit on its lending, but within that's at the fund level. You could still lend the whole stock in one asset, but not others. And so there's a number of things there where I think it comes back to trying to understand the practicalities of that and then having that dialogue with the regulator to help them achieve what they want to get out of it whilst fitting it in around where it best works for the end lender. It shouldn't impact the return to the end lender, and that's the key thing that we should be able to demonstrate.
Yeah,
I think Gary, you've articulated some of the key points really well there, and I think if you look back again, and I'm sorry to harp back to SFTR as the model that we all look at as to how we got there, but I think, if you take scope out of the question, that's a big question we need to know the answer to. But those sorts of examples that Gary just ran through are the ones where the engagement between the industry and ESMA in the run up to SFTR were really critical, asking very, very specific, detailed questions about what are you trying to achieve here? What did we give you this? How will that work? And I think you made a really solid point as well about the sort of potential for over-reporting potentially, or duplicative reporting through the chain, which could make a lot of these numbers meaningless. So I think there's an awful lot of work still to be done in terms of definition. That's not to say that I still don't think it's going to be I still think we're going to be able to deal with the reporting requirement here, but I think the definition that still needs to be worked through is really critical, and obviously, alongside obviously getting the scope clarified.
Yeah, I think in Europe, one of the, as you mentioned, Ed, one of the sort of greatest successes really of the SFTR discussions and consultation process was ESMA's willingness to engage, but not just engage, but understand the industry and understand the challenges and recognise that the industry wanted to comply, they wanted to deliver, they just needed that information. And we saw on a number of occasions the regulator taking a pragmatic approach to a requirement once they understood the challenge or the difficulty to the industry in terms of the delivery or extraction of that data. So we can only hope that we see a similar engagement and a similar pragmatism in the US to resolve some of these issues as we go forward. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you make a good point. I mean, the visibility of the people at ESMA responsible for SFTR was really significant in terms of attending the events that we were going to, speaking and giving their current perspective as things went along. I'm not an SEC expert by any means, but so I'm curious as to whether the same will apply in the US with regulator engagement in the run-up to it.
Okay, and mindful of the time, let's move on to some other beloved regulation. So we've recently seen the FCA make some changes to their reporting of securities finance under the MiFID regulations. Gary, from your perspective, what changes have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it earlier. I think Fabian mentioned about the change in volumes as a result of Brexit, and obviously the FCA decided to take some steps in relation to it. It transposed the bulk of MiFID across, but it made some minor changes. Some of it was around making sure that it still had the right data flowing through for some of that reporting by MiFID financial institutions. But I guess the key one, and it's probably indicative of some of the potential divergence that we all fear, is the RTS 28 reporting around the duty of best execution and the execution venues, where ESMA maintained it even after a review, but the UK just dropped it and said it's not necessary anymore. We're not sure it serves any particular purpose. And although it's a relatively small change, we also saw a little bit of extra changes around SFTR post-Brexit and the implementation for the non-financial counterparties. So it just sort of hints at there might be a slightly different perspective that could be applied to some of these regulations as we move forward.
So, I mean, I guess, if we increasing divergence on one hand, is it a concern, or on the other hand, is it a case that, as we see increased transparency coming across the world, we have our European model, but we see increased reporting requirements sort of feeding through from most other markets in some form or another, and increased transparency. Do you think the FCA's divergence is something to be concerned about, Fabian, or do you think actually, once we've got the European SFTR data, we can meet any requirements?
I think if you can answer the requirement from the European regulator, who are generally quite quite demanding, I think you're quite well armed to face any other regulator on the planet. But of course, you're going to have some variation in terms of like what's being requested. We see like in North America tends to be like single-sided versus dual-sided in Europe and Asia. So I think once you've done Europe, you're able to face the rest of the world. Having said that, and that's the complexity going forwards. I was talking about earlier about a convergence with the regulators speaking together, trying to ask more and more the same data or reporting at the same format. But at the same time, they will still keep this specific divergence, right? So in another panel once, I used like a comparison to an apple cake. Right. So every regulator, they kind of like agree now, you need a bit of flour, a bit of sugar, a bit of apple. But the way you're going to mix this, you're going to end up either with an apple tart or with an apple strudel, right? It's the same ingredients, but the end result, you're looking for something slightly different. And that's going to be the complexity if just to understand the very faint nuances and to keep up with the upcoming changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be for a number of years yet before we get a proper global view on all of these things. Just to finish, it's like just to touch on some of the other regulation which Fabian you mentioned at the beginning. So the CFTC and EMIR refits are due. Again, do you see common themes running through these? Is it just about data quality or other significant changes that we need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, we see it across the planet. EMIR refit, probably one that's going to impact most of the people listening to us today. So under EMIR refit, there are the introduction of like additional fields. So they're going to add up to 40% fields, which is going to take us to up to 203. So even more than for SFTR. The introduction also of the ISO 20022 reporting format. Interestingly, we see that also being introduced in several transaction reporting regulation in Asia. More counterparty data also being added to the EMIR, or expected to be added to the EMIR refit. So quite in line with what we've seen for SFTR, but a few nuances. And interestingly also, adding some specific fields for cryptocurrencies. So which up to today were reported under different reporting methods by default. But then this is being clearly addressed by this upcoming EMIR refit. So yeah, we see again introduction of like lesson learned from the previous regulation and being retrofitted into this refit and rewrite.
Am I right in saying in the CFTC that collateral is going to become reportable for some firms, or is that already the case?
So that will be added. So one thing also for CFTC is a good point where the regulator there look into the introduction of UPI, so Unique Product ID, and the ISO 20022. Because of the complexity of the introduction, these two specific amendments will not be introduced for the upcoming December the 5th, but will be part of the second phase in 2023. So there is an acknowledgement by the CFTC that there are some technicality difficulties about these implementations, and it's part of the constructive approach, I think, that we mentioned earlier from the regulator. Say, okay, we want to get there. That's the journey, but we still listen to the industry. And I think this conversation between the regulator, the trade association, and the industry participants is something crucial to make this rewrite a success.
So just mindful of the time, we've got sort of a few minutes left. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to use the app to send them through, and we'll try to answer them in the next few minutes. And from your perspective, Ed, what's next? What's the next kind of focus or challenge around reporting and transparency? I think
it's difficult to look anywhere other than 10C1 as the next big thing. We've spoken a lot about it, and I think the clarification of the scope. If there's one thing I'd like as soon as possible, it would be that, so that we can hopefully allow some of our people to relax, and others will probably step up and start to think about this more in the project terms that you mentioned to Gary earlier, where there would be hundreds of JP Morgan people running around trying to get ready. But with luck, maybe we don't need that. So I think if there was one, my wish list has had on it. Please can I have the clarification of scope for 10C1?
Yeah. Gary, is that the same for you?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Ed said. I think that's really going to be the focus, looking at that in quite a growing US regulatory agenda generally. That's the big bit around transparency that we need to focus on. And I think for me personally, having completed this panel, I'm off to find some apple cake after Fabian's analogy, because it's just made me feel hungry. Fantastic.
Very good. And for Fabian, from your perspective, obviously you're covering all of these different regulations in minutiae detail for your clients and the reporting across them all. What do you see as the next challenge, should I say? Not necessarily the big challenge, but the next challenge going forward on all of this.
So maybe the next challenge or the next opportunity would be how to address this moving landscape into some sort of unified approach. We see today, speaking with clients, it tends to be different teams, segregated, siloed, speaking to each other to a degree, but only to a degree. And different system. We see a fragmentation of the IT at our clients, but we also see more and more of these clients and firms looking into an integrated approach to make really to take it like not as a tax on business, but say, okay, so how can we turn this and reduce our costs and get something out of it which makes sense? And only taking it as almost as a business line, you can really extract the full value of this challenge.
So essentially, one sort of data feed that provides all of the data for the reporting to sort of almost regardless of product. Yes,
or at least the utilization or the cross utilization of several of these feeds. Again, it's difficult because different regulator will evolve at different pace. So what may be true for one day and a set of specification may not be true the next day. So and keeping up with it is very difficult. And you ideally don't want to have to replicate the same effort. So if you can mutualize some of it, it will be a cost for a save of the cost for the company and making you more competitive in a very challenging landscape.
And I guess it sort of comes back to the same thing. So it's like we've gone through, as you've mentioned, sort of a huge process of developing and producing the SFTR data, and aligning that with all of these other reporting requirements and data requirements around the business. So making that as efficient as it's possible to reduce and keep the costs of that as low as possible. And then on the other side, looking at those benefits. So really kind of like looking to engage with the regulators and utilize the data, as you mentioned, Ed and Gary, in terms of kind of potentially leveling the playing field around retail and alternative funds. But then also, I guess, bringing that back into the firm to feed all of those ancillary kind of processes and services around the business. So using one set of data one set of data out to the service provider to meet your regulatory reporting, but then one set of data, the same set of data being used internally for all of those internal checks and balances and reconciliations and such like.
On that, we already see today, we have some of our clients being covered by multi-jurisdiction, up to 14 of them. And depending on who they have to report to, we receive like one trade, and we're going to feed it with a specificity to 2, 3, 4 different regulators.
Yeah.
So it's something that each firm, it doesn't apply to everybody. Obviously, a lot of firms are only subject to 1, 2 regulations, but it's something to keep in mind. It's not a short-term game, right? You have to play for the long game, and how you're going to keep up with regulation for the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. And seeing some of those benefits coming through in terms of the sort of broader industry and the sort of internal firm processes, I think is really key, because it's easy to see all of this as a huge tax on the business. It's like, and actually, extrapolating some benefits back to the industry and back to the individual firm, I think is critical, because that then allows you to take that 5-year, that 10-year view on the data and where you need to be. So I think, it always amazes me that they always say, that the market will find a way to move forward, and I think securities finance and the way it's dealt with SFTR, and when I think about the first, or it's sort of, I'm not even going to talk about which decade it was, because it's going to make me sound very old. But when I think about when I first came into the industry, and there was no transparency, there was barely transparency to clients, let alone to regulators. And when I think about where we were then and where we are now, it's like that in itself, that kind of level of professionalism and openness and transparency in the market, that has to be a massive positive to the market and to the industry. But moving that forward to kind of extrapolate the benefits from those costs that we've incurred over the last few years, I think will really sort of cement this as a core part of our industry. So good luck with that, and I hope that the US SFTR, I hope you get your wish, Ed, and that it comes through very quickly. So at that, I think we haven't had any questions from the panel. So unless anybody has any additional comments, I think that's just about perfect timing to thank my panelists. So thank you, Ed, Gary, and Fabian, and to hand back to the Securities Finance Symposium. Gabrielle.
The clock is ticking ahead of the CFTC Reporting Rules Rewrite. Is your firm prepared? If you have a CFTC obligation, you need to get ahead of 3 key changes right away. There will be fewer data fields, while specifications will be stricter, requiring changes to valid values, enumerations, and formats. The timing of submissions for Part 45 will change to T+1 or T+2. This will allow firms to collect all of the necessary data needed for submission. Part 43 will still need to be reported in real time or as soon as technologically practicable. The new rules will bring the CFTC in line with other global regulators that mandate SDs and MSPs to report collateral and margin data in addition to valuation data. This is a totally new CFTC requirement. With so many changes looming, there's no time to waste to prepare for the new rules. The IHS Markit Global Regulatory Reporting Platform can help you get ready today. Over 400 clients use this platform to help with their reporting, with complete coverage across regimes such as CFTC, SEC, EMIR, MiFID, SFTR, and MAS. The platform reduces day-to-day reporting costs and gives firms confidence that they are reporting accurately. The platform delivers a secure, scalable technical architecture, all backed by IHS Markit experts with their fingers on the pulse of regulatory change. Don't wait until the last minute to prepare your firm for the coming CFTC changes. Book a call with one of our regulatory reporting experts today.